Hello. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, who's a truly eminent academic, scholar, activist, and global influencer. Professor Chandrasekhar was a professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in India, for more than 30 years. He also served as visiting faculty at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, as executive editor of Deccan Herald Group of Publications, as a consultant at the Bureau of Industrial Costs and Prices, the Ministry of Industry in India, and as a research associate at the Centre for Development Studies in Trivandrum. His areas of interest include the role of finance and industry in development, and the experience with fiscal, financial, and industrial policy reform in developing countries. Besides numerous articles in academic journals, his publications include a large number of books and co-authored books. Crisis as Conquest, Learning from East Asia, The Market That Failed, Neoliberal Economic Reforms in India, Demonetization Decoded, A Critique of India's Currency Experiment, and Karl Marx's Capital in the Present, 4 essays. He's a regular economic columnist for Frontline, for Business Line, and the Economic and Political Weekly, that staple of Indian public life. He's also served as a consultant with a host of international organizations, the UNDP, the ILO, UNCTAD, ESCAP, the ADB, and ECLAC. So it's my great pleasure, I'll stop there. I could have done a few more pages if you want. No. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Chandru, if you'd like to.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bracken, and thanks to the department, to Andrew Sumners, to Alfredo, an old friend, for giving me this privilege to be here. To give you some of my views on what would be a very large set of issues which involves a large canvas, inspired in part by the concept note which was provided of looking to the past and looking forward into the future. Now, what I want to sort of run through in some sense, some very familiar territory, but really to look at the fact that in the past, or at one point of time, when people discussed multipolarity, the idea was essentially to look at what would be the existence of nodes in the north, largely. Of course, there was one instance in which we had competing superpowers, particularly the Soviet Union and the capitalist bloc. But otherwise, it used to be forms of inter-imperialist rivalry, let us say, where you had countries like the United States, the UK, Japan, Europe, and so on. Though there was occasional mention, not much focus in this discussion on multipolarity was there on developing countries, countries in the South, and the ways in which they could have influenced or could possibly influence in future the structure of the international economic order in particular. I shall stick to the international economic order, which is where I have some degree of competence. Now, if we look at the shifts in global power relations since the Second World War, there have been many occasions in which there has been reason to believe that there's occurring a shift in terms of what's happening with respect to the relative powers of nations, particularly nations in the South vis-a-vis the earlier imperial nations, and of course subsequently the developed market economies. The first, of course, was the post-war wave of decolonization, which gave rise to independent nation states, governments in developing countries, which decided to launch on state-led import substituting strategies, which would essentially try and transform these economies by putting at the center of their economic structures a manufacturing sector. And the whole idea at that point of time was the diversification to manufacturing was the way in which you could actually increase productivity and shift labor out of low productivity activities, particularly agriculture. This actually was to a certain extent successful for a period of time. In fact, there were progressive economists like Bill Warren, for example, who actually said that imperialism or the spread of capitalism globally was resulting in a situation where it was transforming other countries and in some sense was moving capitalism or diffusing capitalism to developing countries to an extent where no more is imperialism itself an issue because of the fact that so much power was moving as a result of import substituting industrialization to the developing countries. This, of course, was followed at one point of time by something which appeared even more dramatic, which was the export success of the first-tier, newly industrializing economies. In particular, of course, if we speak of Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, but in particular South Korea, which seemed to herald a sort of new era in the diffusion of capitalism or the diffusion of development globally. The notion which existed in progressive circles for a long period of time, that there existed structural constraints created by colonial powers, which prevented developing countries, unless they moved out of the framework of capitalism and being market economies, to be able to actually catch up or close the gap. And the idea was that here was a set of countries which, over a period of time, registered rates of growth, so that if we use the conventional index of what constitutes being a developed economy, which is the per capita income, or if you use the World Bank's Atlas method, the per capita GNI, actually at one point of time became developed countries, at least in terms of that specific index. And moreover, there existed in these countries corporations which, or business groups, chaebols, which actually were in a position to be able to challenge in many areas many transnational firms which earlier dominated the international economy. So that appeared to be another occasion in which this is happening. The third significant one, of course, was the decision of countries, the oil-producing countries, to nationalize their oil assets, form the OPEC cartel, and then resort to price increases, the two so-called oil shocks, 73-74 and 79-81, which actually resulted in a redistribution of world income in favor of the oil producers. And that, in some sense, had a fallout because it set off a whole process of development in other countries, particularly because of the migratory stream which we had from countries, particularly in Asia, of masons and drivers and construction workers and so on, who moved to these countries because of the large investments that they were making as a result of the surpluses they got out of this. And then, once this seemed to be on, we had the second-tier industrializers in Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand and Malaysia, to a certain extent Indonesia, which seemed to actually register once again relatively high rates of growth based on manufacturing. And here again it appeared that this whole notion that there exist structural constraints on transformation which can actually result in a diffusion of capitalism and development was seen to be getting challenged. In particular, that is a position which was held by the Comintern for a long period of time, the Communist International, and that seemed to have come under challenge as a result of some of these examples. And finally, when the optimism with regard to the second-tier industrializers waned, we suddenly had China and India emerging on the scene, and we do now know that still there is this talk of the two countries. Of course, there are significant differences, as I shall refer to. Now, okay. Now, in some sense, if you take all of these instances, there is something seems to be more consequential, at least in the discussion, on the shift which is occurring as a result of the rise of China. This, of course, is only an unfolding story. China's increased influence or voice, even if it's not a threat to the position of, well, the United States as hegemon, let us say, is actually, it seems to be along a trajectory which is going to make a significant difference to the world order. And this is important, I mean, partly because the perception of China, even of the dominant powers, is one in which they see it as a threat in a significant sense. And despite the invasion of Ukraine, the consolidation of NATO and possible expansion of NATO, etc., still China is identified as the greater danger as far as the principal hegemon is concerned, as far as the United States is concerned. Now, this, I'm sorry. Okay. Now, the question to ask is, given this larger post-war experience with southern nodes, which I've sort of briefly run through, is this assessment of the exceptional nature of the Chinese, the rise of China, as it were, is it warranted? Is there something exceptional? Is the perception warranted given what's actually happening on the ground? And if so, what explains the exceptional character of that experience? And if it is exceptional, are there factors adequate enough to ensure strengthening that trajectory? And to answer those questions, I'm suggesting that it may be useful to actually go back to this history of the emergence of poles in the South at different points of time, the many moments. In one sense, I'd like to suggest that all of the promises which existed in the period for the Second World War till, as I said, this new exceptional circumstance of the rise of China, that they were promises which were belied. By the mid-1960s, it was very clear that import substitution strategies across the developing world, whether it be in Asia or Latin America, including in countries like India and Brazil, which at one point of time, for multiple reasons in the case of India, it was a large country, which besides geographical size and therefore a significant, and a large population, which meant a significant domestic market, and almost a history of a century of factory-based industrialization under the British, was seen as a country which actually is going to make the transition quite easily, because it actually had already an industrial base, even if that base was narrow in terms of the degree of diversification in favor of manufacturing and within the manufacturing sector. But for reasons I shall not go into in detail here, the ability to be able to accelerate growth through state intervention involving a significant degree of state expenditure without running into balance of payments difficulties. And I think that's the most important thing, without running into balance of payments difficulties. Forget inequality, forget poverty, forget generating employment, but just ensuring that you can sustain growth without running into BOP difficulties. That seemed to have become near impossible in many of these countries for a whole host of reasons. And therefore, there was a diminution of voice, that even though these countries at one point of time seemed to be a challenge, as Bill Warden pointed out, there seemed to be a diminution of voice. Secondly, if you take the contractionary response, Paul Volcker has discussed much now, because of the current inflation, the response that he had, it resulted in a situation where after those two oil shocks, which accelerated inflation in the developed industrial economies, we went through a period in which, because of the global recession, which was precipitated by those actions as a response to the inflation, we entered an era in which demand for primary commodities, including oil, fell. And maybe a decade later or a little more, we actually reached a situation where if you looked at the real price of oil, deflated by some index of inflation in other commodities, you ended up with a situation where the oil price, the real oil price, was back where it was before the two oil shocks of the 1970s. So there again, it didn't happen. Now it is true that still energy is an extremely important resource, but what we see is that to the extent that there are fluctuations, there are periods of significant and rapid rise in oil prices, that most often you find the OPEC, now the OPEC plus cartel, which includes Russia, a major producer, is always in defensive mode. You're trying to find ways of preventing the oil price from falling below a certain level, which you think is the level at which you have a reasonable possibility of generating surpluses to sustain the kind of growth that you've been able to sort of pull through for a certain period of time. Then, of course, what emerged is that the industrialization of the NIEs, as I said, if you really look at it, we have Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. Singapore is a nation state. I'm not mentioning Hong Kong because Hong Kong is not a nation, as we know. Now it's not even two systems, it's one country. So we basically had Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. If you ignore Singapore because it's a city-state, and if you take into consideration the fact that Taiwan is not merely a small country otherwise, not in terms of national income, but also has a sort of strange position as a nation. Even countries other than, of course, the one which claims it to be a part of its territory, not actually recognizing it in full as a full nation. They basically have one country, which within the framework of a market economy managed to make the transition where it moved from less developed or underdeveloped status to developed status in terms of just that one index of getting your GNI to a level which could treat you as a high-income country. Because we can't treat becoming a member of the OECD as becoming developed. Mexico is also a member of the OECD. So we really have to look at it in terms of that index, and I'm using that crude index of GNI. So that too was belied in terms of the fact that, okay, you had South Korea, but that's all you had. That you really didn't have more than one, perhaps two examples of countries which made this transition. Now, in the case of these countries too, the change we know occurred in the, under economic policy regimes which were not regimes which in some sense challenged the international economic order, which attempted to try and de-link from the international economic order. The industrial transition was based on manufactured exports to the developed countries. There was, of course, as many people in extremely valuable and interesting work pointed out, there were developmentalist states that managed or regulated both markets and capital to making the state the principal agency for realizing this mercantilist strategy of using the export market as the basis for growth. But that required, it appears, a close relationship with the hegemon. If diffusion had to occur, it seemed to be that you needed this close relationship. But if you look at much of the discussion, and I'm not talking, this is not a critique, I mean, all of us, when you teach, you need a model. And finally, the model was what? The model was the developmentalist state in Southeast Asia. So, so the discussion became on the relative role of states and markets, on domestic markets and external markets, the importance of the developmentalist state, etc. And this model, however, as we know now, I mean, not what I'm saying, but we know from history, that this model is proved difficult to emulate. China may be an exception now. Maybe tomorrow we'll begin to treat China as also a market economy based on export-led growth with the developmentalist state of some kind, not maybe exactly the South Korean kind. Now, the point is, taking this perspective perhaps underplayed the role of the state on the other side of the developed-underdeveloped debate. Because we know from history, even during the colonial period, no developed, even Britain, even though it was much more of an open economy, no developed country grew on the basis of actually having no protection. They all resorted to protection of differing degrees, both in the competition between themselves as well as in order to be able to prevent, let us say, imports of textiles from developing countries, from the colonies to enter into Britain, for example. So if that be the case, if you're using that kind of protectionist device, then what you're saying is, I mean, if there was this challenge which was coming from the NIEs, in this case, of course, the two principal Southeast Asian NIEs, you could have resorted to that, but you actually did not see any resort to that. So the state on the other side of the developed-underdeveloped debate also played a role in accommodating these countries in order to be able to sustain this growth. Now, it mattered that, therefore, the success of the East Asian industrializers, so it mattered for them that the US was willing to keep its markets open. And why did the US do it? The US did it because of the fact that, in some sense, South Korea was part of a larger strategic agenda of the United States. And what that did was it not merely, let's face it, it not merely provided South Korea access to markets, both within itself and in markets of its allies, but there was an implicit sovereign guarantee of the United States government for borrowing by the South Korean central bank and the banking system, which was largely public, and use that money for the industrialization effort. Why was there this implicit sovereign guarantee? Why can one argue? Because during that period, when South Korea, in order to keep Japanese capital at bay, did not want too much foreign direct investment to come into the country, it actually borrowed significant amounts from the international market in order to be able to import technology as well as capital goods. Now, if you look around at that point of time, no developing country could actually go to the market for private finance because they were considered to be too risky in multiple senses. They were politically risky, they were risky because of the fact that they were weak economies, and they were risky because of the exchange rate risk. So you actually could not pick up your phone and call whatever, New York or the city of London or Frankfurt, wherever it was me, and say, listen, I've got a balance of payments problem. Can I have a couple of $1 billion or $5 billion or whatever it may be? You didn't have access to these markets, but South Korea did. And that combined with the access to the markets actually provided a situation, and of course other things which happened at the point of time when the transfer of power is happening after the Japanese were moved out in terms of social and historical factors, which I won't go into. And the evidence that all of this mattered, of course, is that even today, South Korea is the country which has the third largest number of American bases within its territory. Now, then there was the promise, and I'll finish with this, but then there was a promise of, okay, the second tier, industrializers. Suddenly we seem to have another option, another challenge to the Comintern position. This lasted for a significant period of time, but not enough to actually make that transition to developed country status, okay? But there was a difference. There was a difference that, unlike in the South Korean case, even if you sort of saw these as quasi-developmentalist states in some sense, these were strategies or trajectories in which what you actually had was the targeting of the mercantilist strategy, if there was one. The targeting of global markets was essentially based on using foreign investors who are willing to come to these countries and use them as basis for world market production, to use that to a certain extent as the basis for growth. Now, this, of course, obviously means that in more than the senses in which South Korea dependent upon, let's say, world markets, world capital, etc., in more than that sense, you were dependent also on foreign direct investment. So there was a weakness in terms of, at all, you're seeing this as a potential rise in, or potential source for significant voice in the international order. Now, the implication of that is that that phase of the emergence in southern nodes was one in which developing countries were in some sense becoming instruments for battle for transnational firms and developed countries competing with each other for world markets. You needed locations which would actually allow you to produce whatever, cheaply, produce in some form, be close to raw materials, whatever it may be, in order to be able to actually compete with the other. Now, if that is the reason you're chosen for a strategy which appears mercantilist, then obviously, in that kind of war, you don't need too many instruments for battle. So you actually saw that in a very short period of time, if you looked at, world manufactured exports, it was true that the share of developing countries in manufactured exports was rising. But despite the fact that the share of developing countries in manufactured exports was rising, a few developing countries, maybe 4, maybe 6, would account for 75% of total manufactured exports. 80%, that of course finally became 1 when China came to dominate. But you basically had a situation where this was not a process of diffusion even to the extent that it went, which actually moved, even though people spoke of the signs of the flying geese phenomenon. I mean, and you would expect a flying geese phenomenon, because if you suddenly see a rush of foreign investors, you see exports, you see, let's say for a short period, you see a current account surplus, you would end up with a situation when you'll have a number of problems, like happened in Thailand. You'll soon have infrastructural bottlenecks because of the fact that you're not able to manage the pace of growth fast enough. You'll have wages rising. You might lose the GSP preferences that you get in world trade because you're becoming you're being graduated out of them because you're developing. You might actually see an appreciation of your currency because periods of current account surpluses, which actually undermines the competitiveness of your exports. So you put all of this together, and it is true that you cannot continue to be a competitive location. If you're actually successful, that success breeds failure. So people started speculating that we're going to have this flying geese phenomenon where, you'd move from, maybe Malaysia to Cambodia, from Cambodia to Vietnam, from Vietnam to India, Mexico, you could go anywhere in the world. But we didn't see too much of the flying geese phenomenon. So even there, first of all, we didn't see a transition to developed country status, and we didn't see this being a phenomenon which would involve diffusion in a larger, significant sense. We earlier had 1 or 2 countries being successful to make the transition, but just 1 or 2. Now we have few, but can't make the transition. So if you look at it, the other problem with this was, of course, that at the point of time when this transition was occurring, both had partly occurred, but was still occurring in the first year in the new industrializers and the second year, that was the period in which, as a result of all what happened in the developed countries in the period after the late 1960s and starting from the 1970s, the economic crisis, the inability to sustain the golden age, we saw the rise of finance. You saw a process of financialization, and financialization which resulted in the globalization of finance. Now, if you're actually dependent as a southern node on the northern nodes, then obviously at some point of time, the northern nodes, if they want it, will ask you for a quid pro quo. I mean, you don't even have to be a southern node. We know what the Plaza Accord was. because of the competitiveness of Japan, you forced Japan to appreciate the yen, which actually resulted in a situation where there was a hollowing out of Japanese industry. Most of it moved to the second-tier new industrializers looking for new places to compete from. So you essentially had a situation where there was a demand that you should begin to open up your doors to the movement of finance. And that's when we saw the large flow of finance, which over a period of time resulted in a situation where there was increasing financial vulnerability, which wasn't noticed for a significant period of time, but then finally precipitated the 1997 Southeast Asian crisis. And when that happened, all the dynamism of that region, including the dynamism of South Korea, in some sense got undermined. And we didn't see these countries anymore even being seen as an economic challenge of any significant magnitude, though, as I said, two of them had made the transition. Now, even besides this, there was one other issue, that if you happen to be running this kind of a dependent strategy of success, you cannot be a voice which is actually calling for a shift to the international order. Let's look at the major voices. You're looking at, Nehru from India, Nasser from Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. These were not the countries which adopted these kinds of strategies. These are the countries which, after decolonization, basically decided to go in for import substituting industrialization, tend to use the fact that the Soviet Union existed, wanted to be non-aligned, and therefore had a voice, and sometimes came together in different kinds of combinations. More recently, of course, BRICS, G24, G77. We have all sorts of combinations, not that they're all that powerful, but that was the voice. The voice did not come from the economic successes. The voice came from countries which were not that successful, okay? Now, I want to use this to make a couple of points about the new contenders. And I'll focus on China because I don't have time. I'll just take about another 5-7 minutes. I don't have time, so I'll focus on China. And both in the case of China and India, it of course matters that these are not merely fast-growing countries. Not now. Both countries have slowed, but that doesn't mean there cannot be a revival. One of the interesting things about writing on China is that if you go back, maybe 5 years and definitely 10 years, it was all this hype about this country which is now going to take over the world. If you now go and read, including Ruchir Sharma recently in the Financial Times, it's all about this country which is actually, it started with saying that, the financial collapse is coming. We've been hearing about a financial collapse in China now for a decade. But now it is saying, this growth has slowed, and that's the end of it. That's the end of the China story. Maybe true, I don't know. But the point is, it's interesting that when it actually is reaching a situation where it is going to make the transition to be a developed country, you have not merely the perception of a threat, but you also have people basically saying that, this story is over. Now the thing is, if you look at it in terms of, I don't know if you can look, see this, but if you can, if you set the value of the US at 100 in each year, China's GDP in constant 2010 market exchange rates, now I'm not using PPP for this, it rose from 10 in 1991 to about 63 in 2019, okay? Whereas if you look at India, it moved from 6 to 16. So we're not really talking about India being, as everybody says, we're not talking about it in being. So let's really talk about China, okay? If you actually, take the World Bank classification, and which I said is a high-income country, in the figure which the World Bank uses, I'm just using the same figure, is $13,205 in fiscal 2021. China's gross national income per capita in that year was $11,890. It's still not a high-income country, but it's almost there. If you take India, it's 2,170. So again, we're really talking about China, and we're talking about a China which appears to be threatening to do what South Korea did at one point of time. And the question is, what is the implication? Now, okay. Now, there are 2 or 3 features of this transition in China, which I want to sort of, which a lot of people speak about, but I think it's useful for this discussion. First, China's manufacturing transition occurred much before its embrace of reform and markets. Because the story I'm telling, in fact, if you look at this study by the Asian Development Bank, which is about a decade back, It talks about Asia's structural transformation. And it talks about what? It talks about rapid industrialization in the four NIEs. It talks about the wave of industrialization in Southeast Asia using large Japanese overseas investment. And it talks about the incorporation of the People's Republic of China into the global economy. So this manufacturing transition is important, but actually the manufacturing transition actually occurred. It peaked in 1978-80. What is interesting is after having peaked in 1978-80, if we take the reform as 1978, it actually began to go down, as all such transitions are. It went down 8.5 percentage points and more or less remained at that level, which meant that manufacturing continues. Despite the growth of services subsequently, manufacturing continues to be very important in this country. And that was also more or less the kind of trajectory which we observed in South Korea. So how can we assess this? Okay? Now, I think recent declarations from Western sources seem to offer one reason why the China experience might be different and therefore could possibly turn out to be exceptional. Okay? And one is that there's a real fear of advance on the technological front. And so the argument is China is misusing technology which it appropriates or steals intellectual property in order to move up the value chain, and of course use it also for intelligence and military purposes, etc. So the whole idea is we have to stop the advance of the technological advance of China. Okay, and we know recently 140-page report from the Bureau for Industry and Security basically was the one which justified the fact that we need to prevent China from having access from any firm which has anything to do with the United States to advanced semiconductor chips and equipment which manufacture these chips. You're in some sense trying to stymie the process of technological advance in China, okay? Now, this suggests that what really matters for China, in looking at the China example, is the substance, and I'm looking at it purely from an economic point of view, is the substance of China's success. And there are three features that I want to quickly underline. One is China, if you look at the original China manufacturing story, what was it? It was actually using knowledge in production. That is, you basically said, listen, let's get a set of transnational firms to come and set up production here because they have the capability to produce, maybe labor-intensive subsequently, maybe you go up the value chain, but you get them to put their knowledge into production within your boundaries, okay? But now we've made a transition into knowledge for production. You're basically saying, no, I want the knowledge to undertake production. You want to make a move up the value chain using technology, okay? The second is that there is an ability to use foreign exchange earnings from export success by not frittering it away in imports in significant measure, but you use it to generate current account surpluses, which then build reserves. Ilma's accuse has this nice separation between reserves which are earned, which means you get current account surpluses out of exports and you earn those reserves, as opposed to reserves which are borrowed. I mean, if you take India's foreign exchange reserves, I mean, most of India's foreign exchange reserves actually reflect liabilities on its balance of payments. It doesn't have current account surpluses for very long periods of time. It hasn't had a current account surplus, excepting in individual years, which basically means that you can have a situation of the kind that we are seeing, that there are 100 billion has flowed out of India in a period of about a year because of the fact that there was this fear first and the actual happening of a hike in interest rates in the United States, okay? So if you actually earn your current, your reserves, it gives you a certain strength. Behind those, you can actually use it as a curtain to drive an investment-led strategy. We know that China's investment rates, 40% plus. The problem with the import substitution strategy regimes was that when they tried to drive growth on the basis of public expenditure in investments, they ran up against a balance of payments problem because they couldn't generate the export earnings and the current account surpluses, which offered the buffer for them to be able to sustain that strategy for a large number of reasons. But here's a country which seems to be able to do it. So if you look at it that way, the point is, I think there are these three things which are very important. One is the ability to move up the value chain, and if you look at the shift to high tech, these are all National Science Foundation figures. I'm not going to tie you with it now, but I can leave this thing. But it's available in the 2-year reports or 3-year reports of the NSF. Very clear evidence, a huge advance of China It's, in terms of share of global value added in R&D industries from 6 to 21%, whereas it's falling in US and EU. There's big R&D surge from 33 billion, it's gone up to 496 in PPP dollars, of course. Very high compound rates, et cetera. And it's not just a manufacturing hub anymore. It's becoming an R&D hub in pretty advanced areas, okay? So, this has actually created a situation where it's not merely that you don't have the same problems that all of those previous examples of the southern nodes had. You also have one very important example, which was when the Soviet Union finished the extensive stage of growth, when it actually was in a position to be able to grow rapidly with investment by absorbing surplus labor. You basically absorbed all your surplus labor. You generated full employment, of course, but that was the basis on which you sustained very high rates of growth. But once that extensive phase was over and you needed to go into an intensive phase, you somehow saw the Soviet Union, as many writers on that now group of countries have noted, it began to flounder. It couldn't actually make the transition. Whereas it appears that China is making the transition because of the fact that it's able to move up the value chain. It's becoming an R&D hub. It is be able to generate current account surpluses. I mean, I'll just show you this last graph. These actually, the upper quote, this is actually have the cumulative change in reserves over that period, and that's the cumulative current account balance. Obviously, the top right-hand side quadrant would be countries which have both, that actually use current account surpluses for current account reserve accumulation. We don't have in the Balance Payments Manual 6 figures for Japan for this period, so you find China and Singapore here. You go beyond the 1997 crisis, Singapore falls back. We now have figures for Japan, but China is up there once again in the right-hand quadrant. And you go to 2007-19, the period since the global financial crisis, China is ahead than even Japan in terms of being able to combine cumulative current account surpluses and cumulative changes in reserves. So you put all of these together, and I do think that there is a difference this time. Will this difference make any actual difference? That's a speculative question. But it does mean that China would have to move out, because if you continue to rely on the base, we are in a world in which we have been experiencing two kinds of relocations, the relocation of manufacturing and the relocation of finance. India, for example, didn't benefit from the relocation of manufacturing, and it's got too much of the relocation of finance, and it's become, therefore, very vulnerable. China has got some of the relocation of finance, but because it could use the difference between Hong Kong and the mainland market, it actually, to a certain extent, managed to control the vulnerabilities, well, to a certain extent. But on the other hand, it benefited significantly from the relocation of manufacturing, which makes it dependent, like the NIEs were, on the developed industrial economies, which basically means that can it be a powerful new node? Well, not really, unless it can make the transition to a growth strategy which is largely based on its domestic markets, and it can continue to ensure that it doesn't suffer the consequences which were suffered by the import substitutors of running into balance of payments difficulties when you try to maintain a high rate of growth. And of course, all of this is going to come with a backlash. We're seeing it now. The idea is to isolate China. You can understand. This is competition. We are not, there's no altruism here. So you're going to see the backlash, and if the backlash is there, China must be in a position to be able to face it. Partly it's trying to gain legitimacy by using the BRI, by using currency swaps, helping the poorest nations, by setting up AIIB, et cetera, et cetera. It wants legitimacy, at least in Asia, possibly also in the main international institutions. And if all of that happens together, maybe we'll finally see a true success. Thank you.